Let's bring in presidential historian and Rice University professor of history, Douglas Brinkley. It's good to see you, Doug. So, given the huge ruling by the Supreme Court on Trump's tariffs on Friday, you can imagine some changes may be underway to the president's speech Tuesday. What are your expectations from him as the Supreme Court justices take up some front row seating?
Well, I bet you go back in history and recall that Gerald Ford actually had the temerity in 1975 to go in front in the State of the Union and say the state of our union is not good. Ford was a man talking truth and honesty. Donald Trump is not going to say that due to his predilection. So what we're looking at now is a visual show. Which Supreme Court justices are going to show up after that rebuke? Will he call out the 6 justices by name, all of them, and deride them? Will the Chief Justice Roberts just be there and take a tongue lashing from the president and just stare straight ahead? So it's going to be a very interesting visual aspect of it, but it couldn't be worse for Donald Trump to give a State of the Union address after his major economic rollout. Tariffs, which are unpopular with 65% of the public, has just been called illegal. Overreach of executive power, that presidential powers do have limits, as Donald Trump's queuing up to give this speech.
Yeah. You mentioned Gerald Ford, and of course, we should tell those who may not be of a certain age that was in the wake of the Watergate scandal with President Nixon. But let's talk about the lashing that Trump handed out on Friday, accusing those justices of being influenced by foreign entities, Doug. Has there been ever this kind of direct attack from a president on the court before? Because to onlookers, I'm curious if this says more about the court or about the president.
Oh, this obviously says more about the president. Other presidents would be far too dignified to do that. We have to keep in mind the State of the Union address wasn't at first televised by Harry Truman in 1947. But it didn't go to prime time till 1965 with Lyndon Johnson. And it's evolved over time where Ronald Reagan started the tradition of bringing guests. And, it's really a body language feast. And in recent years, we're seeing hecklers, people that there will be a lot of Democrats that are going to stay home to their home state and do town halls like in Oregon with, Senator Wyden and Merkley, and then there'll be this alternative Democratic event. So it's really a tight one for Trump. Traditionally, you get a bump on doing these because you're getting 30, 40 million people ostensibly watching you without a quick rebuttal. But in this situation, Democrats not there, tariffs, the economy in tatters. People don't feel that their lives have gotten better in the last year, and war looming, Iran, what's going on with Cuba. And most importantly, I think he'll lean in, if you're a speechwriter, on the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which was the State of the Union, claiming this is the hemisphere. And certainly President Trump will try to say he's continuing that Monroe Doctrine, policy with Venezuela and his recent strikes at gunboats and drug.
To your point, the president has consistently lost ground in polling, even on his strong issues like immigration and the economy. He has claimed many times, Doug, to have defeated inflation and succeeded on affordability. If he continues this messaging Tuesday, does he risk being seen as out of touch?
Alex, that's the big question, and the answer is yes. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, Joe Biden, in many ways, saved his Democratic nomination when he gave a good State of the Union address. But presidents tend to want to say the economy's not as bad as you think, and they'll throw statistics at you. But the American people right now are not feeling it. They're not feeling the affordability. They're feeling left behind. They're feeling stressed. It's all about the economy, and Donald Trump will try to sell it, afraid, as being it's booming and the tariffs are working, when the American public is suspicious simply because they know their own costs for electricity and gasoline and milk.
Mm-hmm. Doug, I know there is no real expectation that he will deliver a unifying message, but what is your best hope for this speech?
I would hope that President Trump does not single out and browbeat the Supreme Court justices that had to make a ruling, and they did it in a judicious way. I would hope that he doesn't talk about ICE and Minneapolis as being a triumph of some kind when, you're seeing people just shot dead American citizens. I think he will try to talk about he's lived up to the making the border safe and trying to crack down on people not documented in our country, which is the issue he waves the most on. But you're guaranteed to get overreach because he will demonize people. He's got his list of who he wants to spike at. And in the end, State of the Unions are often a lot of promises these days. Here's what we'll do. And a year later, it's a themeless pudding.
Democrats have some momentum politically heading into the midterms, but this may be the only time we see a Republican House Speaker behind Trump in a State of the Union speech. How crucial is this speech for Republicans ahead of November, Doug? And have the prospects of a president's party ever depended so much on one person?
Well, oftentimes things depend on one person. I mean, you could just look at FDR, say, in 1941 State of the Union. We're heading into, World War II, and everything was, you had to be with FDR. You weren't really a Democrat. But even FDR had people, conservative Democrats holding him accountable, like when he tried to pack the Supreme Court. Donald Trump has no real opposition in the Republican Party. You got the Epstein files looming. You're going to have survivors of the Epstein files being brought in to the chamber by Democrats. And you've got just a crazy mix of issues that Trump's going to try to bully boy over. And yet a lot of Democrats are waiting for the second he's done to try to hit the airwaves in every conceivable media outlet known to man.
Yeah, starting with Abigail Spanberger, who will deliver the rebuttal. All right, Douglas Brinkley, it is good to see you. Thank you so much for your sage sights on all of this.